And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
The Haida people have called Haida Gwaii home since time immemorial. Their traditional territory encompasses part of southern Alaska, the archipelago of Haida Gwaii, and the surrounding waters. On today's Open Connection, we open our archives to bring you this story from 1979.
The Queen Charlotte Islands Museum in Skidegate recently won one of 3 awards presented by Heritage Canada. The Community Service Awards are given in recognition of groups, individuals, and companies whose efforts have benefited their community.
At Skidegate on the Queen Charlotte Islands, there is a museum built into the rocks overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The museum is operated by Tricia Gessler, the only full-time curator, and she's working to preserve much of the old culture of the islands. Her dedication so far seems to have met with considerable success, with a recent national award recognizing the Queen Charlotte Islands Museum Society for its efforts, and with the showing of exhibits from elsewhere, most notably the Legacy exhibit, a show of contemporary Indian art from several different nations. The museum itself is very young. Not yet 4 years have passed since it was built, but the Museum Society has been around for much longer.
It began as a museum society years ago. The idea was even 20 years ago or more. And we just opened 3 years ago when finally the Museum Society got grants for actual construction. So we're still not finished putting permanent displays together and permanent exhibits, things of that nature.
Did it take that 20 years to collect displays?
To some extent, but mostly people were collecting information and photographs and setting aside some things they'd hoped one day would go into the museum.
Did it take you very long then to fill this up with various artifacts?
Not really. There's a sizable collection. What's taking time is building the cases to house them, because we start from scratch. We get to McMillan Blodell has donated logs, and we mill the lumber and do the whole case from the log to the finished product here.
So who do you depend on now for financial support to keep the museum going?
The regional district funds the minimum operating expenses of the museum, and beyond that it's just donations and occasional government grants for specific short-term projects.
Well, what kind of exhibits do you have here?
The permanent displays are in the long run going to be particularly totem poles, old totem poles, and there's a constant ongoing restoration project with those. You can see one behind us here. And Haida artifacts, and all of that makes about 60-65% of the collection. Then there's also the really unique natural history and the history collections from the islands that are smaller but fairly complete.
Yeah, I noticed you got into some wildlife with some of the stuffed animals here as well.
Right, and that in particular is what's going to go on display when this exhibit leaves. We'll be building a permanent natural history gallery.
Do you get traveling exhibits very often?
We do, but this is the largest one that's here now that we've ever had. We usually get a small one, or we'll create an exhibit ourselves from material that we can get on loan. We aren't quite yet set up again because of display cases to handle large exhibits that we have to house ourselves in cases.
Do you plan on trying to get a higher profile? For example, Kassan. Just about everybody knows about Kassan. What about this museum?
Yes, we are going to try to do that. We've had a number of visitors from literally all over the world, and without particularly advertising, it's surprising the number of people and where they're coming from. But we will be trying to do more of that, especially once the permanent displays are complete.
How do they generally react to what you've got so far?
Most people are really impressed. I think they're so surprised to come to what they consider is a really remote area and find a museum like this. A lot of people will walk in and say, expect that this is a city museum, and how did it get here? And they're very surprised and very pleased with it.
How did people decide on the location? It's really spectacular looking out the windows here.
Years ago, the Museum Society is made up of people all over the islands, representing every town and community. And they had an islands-wide vote some years ago where the museum would be. And this is sort of the geographic center of the islands. But many other sites were contemplated, but they chose this one because of them. Exactly because of the scenery and because of the rocks and the forest behind the museum.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Thank you for staying with us. Haida art is recognized around the world for its monumental totem poles and sculptures, fine carving in wood, metal, and slate, and weaving. Through countless generations, Haida artists have developed a system of design which they apply to both sculptural forms and two-dimensional art. Let us return to the archive to see some of the art that was on display in 1979.
Called the Legacy, which is contemporary British Columbia Indian art, and it's from all tribes in the province, all different native groups. And it's exciting to have it here because there's not only some of the very finest Haida art here, but there's things from other groups, other areas that many of the Haida artists who are quite expert in their own art aren't necessarily aware of. Things from Kassan, things from the northern mainland, but there's Kwagyouth materials, Salish baskets, and that's intriguing for some of the older ladies here who make baskets, but in an entirely different tradition.
Do you find that some of the artists whose work is exhibited here, have they come in? Have they looked around?
Some have. Those that are here have, yes.
Have they been pretty impressed?
Yes, and they know the exhibit well, though. These things were gathered some years ago in Victoria, and it was first on display at the Provincial Museum in Victoria. And it's been on a limited number of tours ever since. So they sort of came to it looking at old friends when they saw the objects. And there are pieces, in many cases, that they did 10 years ago. So some of the artists even said they wished that they had something more up to date, that they were wished that they were being represented more contemporarily than this exhibit is.
Okay, so what's in the future for this museum now?
We'll be working all the rest of the winter on permanent displays, building more cases, especially the Natural History Gallery. And the next large exhibit will be in the spring. That will be a one-man show of Robert Davidson's art, which will open in UBC in Vancouver and then come here. And there will be other traveling exhibits almost of this size throughout the next year and the year after.
Do you find it an advantage to have people like Robert Davison and Bill Reed and so on from this area?
Yes, it is. One of the interesting things that happened about a year or two ago was a totem pole of Bill Reed's that he did on a commission for Shell Oil has been in London, in England, for many, many years. And after some of the Shell Oil executives came to the museum here on vacation, they were pleased with the museum, impressed and surprised to find it here. And they donated the pole, and it was the first thing to come from really quite some distance to be given back, in a sense.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome back to Open Connection. Located overlooking Prince Rupert Harbour, the Museum of Northern BC is renowned for a spectacular collection of timeless art that bring life to the history and culture of Northwest Coast. The museum also features the dramatic history of more recent period, the fur trade, construction of the railway, and the fishing industry. Let us return to the archives to bring you this story from 1989.
Our current mandate is to collect artifacts that reflect the human habitation of the North Coast from earliest prehistory to the present, to a 50-mile radius of Prince Rupert.
Now, how 50 miles, how does that?
It's basically Quinitza, as far as Quinitza up the Skeena to the east, and including the outer islands, but not the Queen Charlotte Islands, to the west, and up to Portland Canal, and down as far as Hartley Bay.
The artifacts and displays and so on you have at this point, how well do they meet that mandate?
Well, because we're such an old museum and we've been collecting for a long time, we have a lot of items, not necessarily on display, but in our collection that do not reflect our mandate. Things like Etruscan vases.
How about the stuff that does? Are you quite well stocked with the sort of things you need?
Well, we have an excellent collection of native or ethnographic material from this area, but we are trying to build our historic collection. The way our exhibits are arranged are in a thematical order. They tell the story of the people of the North Coast here. We start off with the prehistory and archaeology, explaining that people have lived on the coast here for 10,000 years, in Prince Rupert Harbour for 5,000 years. We have here a profile of a shell midden, which explains the layers of occupation and the types of artifacts associated with the different time periods. These exhibits depict the cultures of this area, the native cultures, as they were at the time of contact with Europeans and fur traders. They explain how the cultures in this area were very unique and that they had a very highly complex social structure without agriculture, because the area is so resource rich that they were able to support that type of lifestyle. One of the most frequently asked questions that we get is, what is a potlatch? And that's what this case does, is explains the potlatch and how it was a system for redistribution of wealth. We have here the exhibits that depict the contact period with the fur traders. and some of the changes that occurred in the cultures at that time. We have missionaries, trade beads, the sea otter that represents the fur trade period, weapons, different materials that the native people didn't have originally. In this area we have our poles here that, well, actually it's one pole that represents monumental art. And that carries over to here with the change that monumental art underwent with the introduction of the tourist trade as well as Christianity. We also have in this area a pictorial exhibit of Metlakatla, the interesting history of that village, and William Duncan, the missionary. These exhibits depict the lifestyles of early Prince Rupert and the industry. We have here, for instance, an exhibit about the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway, which of course is the reason Prince Rupert is here. We have over there logging, ethnic diversity, again the railway. We have a parlor room that would have been typical of the upper middle class at the time that Prince Rupert was established. A kitchen, which would have been again typical. And here we have an exhibit of camera equipment donated by Jack Rathall. Him and his father, of course, were early photographers in this region.
60,000 visitors a year now see these exhibits, but the museum holds many other fascinating artifacts the public never gets to view, and it has a problem with them. It's running out of space.
Well, the year that they opened the building in 1958, that same year they started a fund for expanding the building because it was immediately too small. And they finally did add on to the building in 1971, but it still wasn't enough, and it's just getting from bad to worse.
3 years ago, the museum tried to raise enough money to move into a new building, the North Coast Tribal Council's Chatham development. However, it couldn't win the needed government grants. The museum did get a new roof from the city, however, which solved the problem of water leaking onto its artifacts. With limited space, the Museum of Northern BC makes the best use it can of every nook and cranny. It has 3 areas for storing artifacts, the first in a back room also used as workspace.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Museums have 2 public fundamental trust responsibilities: stewardship and public service. The trust of stewardship requires the museums to acquire, document, and preserve collections in accordance to institutional policies, to be accountable to them, and to pass them on to future generations of public in good condition. In this final segment of Open Connection, we discover how the Museum of Northern BC is preserving art for future generations.
We have drilled holes in them so that the air can circulate, because otherwise, with the concrete wall in behind, the cold air stays in and the dampness. This does help, but it's still, you can feel in there, it's quite cool. And in the wintertime, we get an inch of ice on the wall, and it can have relative humidity levels up to 96%. So we store things that are less affected by those conditions in these cabinets.
What sorts of things would those be?
Well, we have here, for instance, a lot of stone items that you can see. Projectile points, obsidian. It's not going to be that affected.
The second storage area is reserved for the least sensitive items. It's underneath the cabinets in the exhibit room. The skulls stored here will never be displayed, and they'd be returned to the native group from which they came if only their origin could be identified. Lastly, there's a storage room behind an office just beyond the gift shop.
We have most of our more sensitive material in this room. The security's good in this room. Mostly only staff come in here. The humidity is such that it's good for the wooden artifacts. It's a little bit on the high side, but not too high. Dry humidity levels would make the wood crack, and that's what we want to avoid. You can see here we've got a lot of wood in this room. Got all of our miniature totem poles here, masks, all kinds of things. Hey, we also try to keep like items together in our collection, so that we have most of the wooden ethnographic material, so we have the other ethnographic material, such as As you can see here, we have all of our argillite.
Moore is especially interested in argillite carvings, and she's particularly proud of this century-old pole. It was returned to Canada only recently.
We had a gentleman through the museum, and he lived in Arizona, and he said that he had an argillite pole. He had had it appraised years before but couldn't remember the artist, and he wanted to know if we'd be interested in acquiring it. So he sent me the information. In fact, it turned out to be quite significant indeed. It's been two different experts have attributed it to two different artists. One to Charles Edenshaw, who was, of course, the most famous of all argillite carvers, and another one to his stepson, John Robson. So either way, it's very valuable and it's exquisitely carved. So what we did is, when he expressed an interest in selling it to us, and he wanted it to go back to its region of origin, so we applied for a grant through the Import-Export Control Board, and they will provide 70% of the purchase price to repatriate an artifact back to Canada. So that's how we were able to acquire this.
More native baskets are also stored in this room.
They're from all over the Northwest. You have here, this one's Nutchalnuth or Nootka from the west coast of Vancouver Island, very beautifully and finely woven with grass. And then you have a nice spruce root basket here. This is a classic Tlingit style. Cedar bark, that would be local. This is also cedar bark or cedar root, and that's Tsimshian, Salish. You have a classic Haida basket here with the very faded dyes that you can see in rims around the basket. Some cedar bark rope.
As mentioned, controlling heat and humidity is important for preserving sensitive artifacts like these baskets. The museum has a special piece of equipment for monitoring those conditions.
This is a hygrothermograph, and if you look closely, you can see some human hair in there, and that absorbs moisture and loses moisture. So this contraption measures the relative humidity and temperature in this room, and it measures it on a 7-day graph so that we can see if it's going up at night when we go away, or likewise when the light's turned on or when people are working in the room. We can see the effects.
Now, how much change is okay in the humidity and temperature in a storage area like this?
Well, the maximum recommended standards are 3% in any 24-hour period. That's in the relative humidity, and we've had sometimes in this room, but more in other areas of the museum, up to over 10% change in one day. That's a recommended level for an entire year.
With space at a premium, it's impossible for the museum to accept some artifacts offered for donation. The curator has to make some tough decisions.
We are having to turn things away. We're in the process of trying to acquire some temporary off-site storage, so we are telling people to come back in a few months to see if our situation has changed.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Open Connection. The greatest distance in the existence of man is not from here to there, but the connection from his mind to his heart. If we can conquer that distance, we can soar like an eagle and realize our immensity within. I'm Robert Pictou.